Part 1. The Holy Grail. Angie Hastings stepped into the changing booth, laying her purchase over the chair. Cheeks flushed with girlish pleasure, she shut out the busy hum of the showroom, reaching back to unzip her bright red sunfrock. A trim young girl with wavy blonde hair trailing down past her shoulders, she smiled with the vaguely guilty expression of a child caught with her hand in the candy jar. Dropping the dress down to her tiny waist, she began to shimmy it over the curve of her hips. A faint crescent touched her lips. The fever had been raging through her system for more than 3 weeks now. It was like one of those tunes that spiraled endlessly around at the front of your mind, despite your firmest efforts to push it away. Well, the fire would be quenched today, her yearnings finally satisfied. She looked back into the mirror, admiring the lithe flow of her petite figure. Like most girls her age, Angie loved wearing pretty underthings beneath her day clothes. It was a delicious secret she could hide from the rest of the world. Her brassiere was a pastel pink wonder bra, thrusting her full, pert breasts up to form a deeply divided cleavage. One of the straps looped off her left shoulder. It was covered with a delicate white trim. Her flesh was as smooth as alabaster, having only the barest touch of a suntan. Long hair hanging over her face in blonde arabesques, she wriggled her bottom out of the dress's slim waistline, gradually exposing her scanty, high-cut briefs. They were a pair of pink satin bikini panties, decorated with tiny bows and white lace fringes. Gleaming like molten silver against her creamy skin, they looked as if they'd been airbrushed onto her body. She stepped gingerly out of the dress, careful not to catch her stilettos on the red fabric. She'd ruined one too many expensive outfits with a careless turn of the heel. Hanging the frock over the door hook, she swept her hair back from her face, feeling a warm, moist blush rising through her tummy. Angie had good reason to feel excited. She'd found what she'd been looking for. Finally. Stepping across the booth in her undies and high heels, she leaned forward to inspect her purchase. She'd spent close on a month browsing her way through Chamberlain's West Side, visiting every boutique and lingerie store in the fashion quarter, cruising her way around the plazas and the malls. Searching for just 3 shreds of intimate fantasy, remnants of a forgotten decadence. Grinning a radiant smile, Angie picked up the dainty lace garter belt, marveling at its fragile and complicated beauty. A magical wisp of lace, lycra and shimmering liquid satin, it was as complex and as insubstantial as a dream. The suspenders trailed in long, ornate streamers of floral elastic. Stretching the straps between her lacquered fingertips, Angie felt a thrill of pure feminine allure strafe through her entire body. She laid the garter belt back on the chair, imagining how it would look clipped around her waist, then picked up one of the stockings, smoothing it out with her left hand. The jet-black denier whispered enticingly between her fingers. Sheer and gauzy and almost completely transparent, it was a genuine silk stocking, the kind with a reinforced toe and a seam down the back. Angie squandered a few moments admiring its gossamer perfection. The barest touch raised gooseflesh along her arms and shoulders. It felt unspeakably feminine, a thing of dreams and unspoken desires. A long, delicious shiver raced the down length of her spine. The very thought of drawing that nebulous material along her thighs made her ache with anticipation. Kicking off her high heels, Angie bent down to slide the stocking over her right foot. The naughty little girl's smile stole across her features again. Part 2. Politically correct garter belts and suspender stockings were rather difficult to come by these days. You could still find exotic, sensual underwear around the bohemian districts and recycling centers, but the larger retailing chains seemed to stock only the most utilitarian garments. Pedestrian, plain, unimaginative. Some women referred to them as passion killers, recalling the silk ration shortages of the war years. Dull, colorless, and boring. The end of the 20th century had unleashed a virtual torrent of conservative values, a return to the political right surpassing even the lethargy of the Reagan years. Picket fence lifestyles had sprouted across the continent like a furious, virulent weed. Traditional principles had steamrollered their way through urban society, erasing the bright, shining multicultures of the 90s. It had been a bloodless revolution, one in which the good old boys had triumphed without firing a single shot. Nevertheless, these were difficult times for those who wavered at the periphery of the picket fence, those living on the outer rim of the acceptable and the norm. No laws had been passed, no witch hunts mounted against the pink stain, and yet sexual diversity had virtually disappeared from the public eye, even in former pride capitals such as San Francisco or East Village. In the final analysis, invisibility was the safer option, far preferable to the isolation, loneliness, and constant surveillance suffered by the visible. Fortunately, Angie had very little to worry about. She was already invisible. No one would have guessed, even for a second, that she had not been born female. Part 3, Exposure. Are you okay in there? Angie glanced around with a gasp, a vague blush touching her porcelain features. The door to her cubicle had been flung open, allowing the world outside a generous view of the booth's lavender interior. A tall, 30-ish saleswoman stood by the doorway, smiling in at her. Virtually paralyzed with surprise, Angie looked self-consciously into the showroom, frozen in the act of slipping her long, tapering leg into a silk stocking. Embarrassment blossomed in the warm depths of her belly. Angie was young and strikingly beautiful, a willowy adolescent on the edge of maturity. Her eyes were twin pools of late November sky, huge and innocent and glowing with childlike wonder. She crossed her hands modestly over her cleavage, stepping back from the open doorway. "Oh, I'm sorry," the sales assistant apologized, brow furrowed in genuine concern. "Did I startle you?" She was a tall, elegant woman with beaming, elfin face. Her ID tag read Jean, the sort of name that sounded inexplicably appropriate when attached to women of her generation. No, not at all," Angie replied, her face reddening to the tone of a maraschino cherry, "just a little jumpy, I guess. I've been looking for..." Her sentence trailed off into the endless limbo of the unfinished statement. It was ridiculous, ludicrous really. She still grew as coy as a 10-year-old whenever she went shopping for underwear. Jean stepped into the cubicle, absently forgetting to close the door behind her. Angie opened her mouth to say something, but couldn't quite get it out. "Do you need a hand with that?" Jean asked, indicating the garter belt. Angie blinked several times, flustered almost beyond words. "Well, yes, I suppose so. I mean..." The assistant nodded, her smile almost comically sympathetic. "It's okay, I know exactly how you feel. They can be a little difficult, especially if this is your first time trying one on," Jean told her, picking up a handful of lace corsetry and stepping into the narrow confines of the changing space. Taking Angie gently by the shoulders, she turned the blushing young girl towards the mirror. She stood in her bra, panties and stockings, flushed to the tips of her eyebrows. Jean passed the garter belt around Angie's waist and hooked it into place, her fingers moving with the expertise of long practice. Excitement poured over Angie's body like some thick warm fluid, her breathing quickened to swift, shallow spurts. "It's sort of like putting on a bra, except lower down," the older woman was saying. "The tricky part is attaching the stockings." Angie could only nod her assent, feeling the belt constricting her waistline by at least 3 inches. The satin was stretched taut against her rosy flesh, the garters dangled against her bare thighs. Out in the sales room, heads were craning about on flexible stalks. It was Saturday morning, and this was the only store this side of the city to stock European underwear. Evidently half the population of Chamberlain was in the showroom at the moment, and every single one of them wanted a better look. Well, at least the saleswoman's presence was blocking their view for the most part. Thank heavens for small mercies, Angie thought to herself, a tiny giggle rising to her lips. Taking a deep, calming breath, she pushed the laughter back into her belly, shifting her center of balance to her left hip. Her eyes literally danced with feminine mischief. Her heart was pounding in her throat, she felt almost delirious with exhilaration. "There, that's done," Jean said, turning the girl around by the elbows so they were standing virtually face to face. "Now, let's get those garters hooked up. Could you step forward on your right leg for a moment?" Angie thrust her knee slightly forward in the classic pose while Jean began adjusting the suspenders. She fumbled with the clasp for a few seconds, fussing over the garter strap and drawing the stocking up a few inches. Translucent denier stretched against Angie's lean, white haunch. Jean clucked under her breath, hitching up the stocking top with some difficulty in the claustrophobic space of the changing booth. She released the clasp after a brief struggle, then straightened up with an oddly skeptical look on her face. "Here, come out into the showroom," Jean said, taking Angie lightly by the wrist. "There's not enough space in here for the two of us." A 2-second pause. Then, what? Angie's cheeks flared like a pair of wild strawberries. "Come on out," Jean repeated, smiling placidly. "It's a little too cramped in here. There's plenty of space in the showroom." "The showroom?" Angie gasped in surprise. But I'm not wearing anything." Her tummy swarmed with hummingbirds, a wave of panic surged through her entire nervous system. She felt herself stepping into her stilettos, her mind suddenly slipping into autopilot. Her lips parted in shock, eyes bulging from their sockets. What was she doing? "Oh, don't worry about that," Jean replied amiably, leading her forward by the right hand. "We have pretty young girls like you in here all the time. It is a lingerie shop, after all." They were at the very threshold now. In a few seconds, Angela would be exhibiting her lingerie before the entire store. "But there are men out there," Angie tried to say, though the words never actually left her mouth. The store was literally crammed with ubiquitous males, or so she thought, husbands and fathers, Silverman patriarchs in dark smoking jackets, little boys in baseball caps clinging to their mothers' skirts. Angie strutted forward on her impossibly high heels, her head spinning with a mixture of shock, embarrassment and pure, breathless delight. "Anyway, you need to see yourself in the three-way to get the full effect," Jean was prattling on, oblivious to the girl's crimson-faced reluctance. "Those change room mirrors just can't give you the distance you need for a full-length view." "I must be dreaming," she thought wildly as they stepped through the doorway into the brightly lit sales room. Time seemed to pause as she was led towards the central display, weaving a trail through a small forest of gaping mouths and goggling eyes. The store was absolutely bristling with customers, and most of the clientele seemed to be of the masculine persuasion. Angie simply couldn't believe this was happening to her. Although she'd harbored fantasies of this kind for years, she'd never in her wildest dreams imagined she'd find herself parading her gleaming satin underpants before a roomful of startled, and somewhat admiring, onlookers. Her luscious, teenaged body was bursting with the ripening fruit of dawning sexuality. A rare, fine color was stealing up her torso, tinting her red from chin to belly button. This can't be happening, Angie thought once more as the crowd parted before her. Part 4, displays. It had been a black day for all humanity when tights came into fashion. Supposedly, pantyhose were more comfortable, more convenient and much cheaper than stockings, but they were nowhere near as sexy, at least as far as Angie was concerned. Worse still, corsetry had become a rather expensive fashion accessory way beyond her price range. For a while, it appeared that all of her hopes would come to nothing. Fortunately, all was not lost. Following a number of promising leads, she eventually began checking out local second-hand dealers in the West Side. There she stumbled across numerous items of interest: corselets and panty girdles, convertible brasiers, and bodyliners. Some places even had unopened stock in the backroom, donations from hosiery stores with outdated inventory. That was always a rare treat. Angie would practically squeal with delight at the sight of them. The trail had eventually led to this mid-range boutique on the west side of the tracks. Angie had been drawn in by the rich, continental decor, with its Art Deco lamps, crushed velvet draperies and leather-bound armchairs. Lavish, for a place this close to the red zone, which made it all the more intriguing. The idea of a fitting salon conjured up visions of pampered luxury straight out of a 1930s musical comedy, a plush wonderland full of sofas, divans and ottomans, where semi-clad women lolled about in regal splendor. The reality didn't quite measure up to Angie's expectations, but Contessa lingerie possessed considerable charm nonetheless. The staff were polite, the furnishings opulent, and there was indeed a private fitting salon at the back of the store. Of course, she hadn't realized until much too late that it adjoined the display center at the front. Part 5, mirrors. A sizable crowd had gathered inside the boutique. People seemed to be wandering in off the street at random. There must have been close to 40 in all, men, women and children, though mostly men, Angie noticed ruefully, enjoying the rare spectacle of a pretty young girl stripped to her unmentionables. It was like one of those awful nightmares where you suddenly found yourself back in your old classroom wearing nothing but your bra and panties. Except this particular dream was coming true. How can this be happening? Angie thought for the third time, hands pressed firmly over her breasts. How could she be standing here with her pink satin lingerie on show to the world? All she'd wanted was a garter belt and a pair of stockings. Now she was the star attraction of an unscheduled striptease. "Now, if you'll just walk this way," Jean was saying. The older woman led her through the growing throng, directing her attention to the three-way with a light pat to the bottom. Angie's eyes widened in surprise. For a moment she forgot the leering mob around her. Oh! The girl in the mirror was quite beautiful. Large blue eyes lent her an innocent, childlike appearance, framed by a sweep of shining blonde hair. She stood frozen in the glass, her nubile figure on full exhibition. Her bra and panties were glaringly pink against her pale flesh, her legs impossibly long and slim in their gauzy black stockings. The fever was back, coursing through her system with a vengeance. Her breathing had shallowed, she felt delirious, faint, lightheaded. She had literally dreamed of this for years, but never imagined it would be so. Angie felt the saleswoman's fingers on her bare shoulder. "All right, take a few steps around the showroom," Jean said, standing to one side. "Let's see how you look." "What?" Angie started, putting a hand to her mouth. No. I couldn't." "Oh, of course you can," Jean retorted with a dismissive laugh. "You need to move around to make sure the outfit fits properly." "But you don't want any nips and tucks as you walk down the street," Jean smiled, then cast a twinkling eye towards the milling crowd. "Anyway, I think you owe them a little favor after keeping them in suspense for so long." Angie glanced around once more. The store was crammed to capacity now. The clientele appeared to be composed almost exclusively of young males, odd, considering it was a women's boutique, each of whom regarded her with expressions of avid fascination. They'd been waiting here at least 15 minutes, and were determined to get their money's worth, so to speak. "What am I going to do now?" Angie asked herself. There was no escape, no way to avoid her obligations. Jean was right, she'd already revealed her bra and panties, now she had to model her suspender stockings. There was simply no alternative. Lowering her face to conceal a naughty grin, Angie sniggled her assent. All right. I'll do it part 6, propositions later. Are you all right? You're practically trembling from head to toe. Jean handed Angie a long, cold draft of Madoc. She was sitting out in the staff room with a diaphanous pink negligee drawn about her shoulders in a kind of naive modesty. She accepted the drink gratefully, knocking it back in a single shot. I'm okay, Angie stammered, cold flushes swirling through her tummy. It was the fever, raging like an uncontrolled bushfire. Now that the adrenaline rush had passed, she was ready to collapse. You did very well out there, Jean remarked, absently lacing up the girl's negligee. Did you hear all the applause? Most of them thought you were a real model. I'm not. I've never done anything like this before. Really? You seemed so composed out in the showroom, right up until the very end. Have you thought about applying to an agency? No, Angie replied demurely. I've always been too shy. They looked at each other for a few seconds, quietly bonding in their mutual silence. I just realized. The older woman began, after all that, I don't even know your name. It's Angie. Angie Hastings. She neglected to mention she'd been born male, had cross-dressed since the age of 5 and changed her name by deed poll only a few months before. You local to the area? Yeah, kind of. She had a small studio apartment in Escott Valley, over on the north side of town. What do you do for a living? Student at Chamberlain Uni design major. And you've never done any modeling work before? Honestly? No. Never. Not in public, anyway. Another lengthy pause. You know, I haven't seen the store this full in years, Jean mused thoughtfully, her eyes roaming up and down Angie's trim silhouette. She'd rarely seen a girl with such exquisite proportions, and that was frankly amazing, considering how many fittings she'd done over the past 15 years. Out in the display center, the crowd was chanting for an encore. More importantly, cash registers were buzzing in unison. The showroom was a hive of activity. Shop assistants scrambled from booth to booth as stock practically flew off the shelves. Jean would have bet her eye teeth that suspender stockings had just come back into style. The implications were obvious. Visions of dollar signs danced through her head. Jean leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a rather conspiratorial level. Angie, I have a proposition for you. The two women spoke in hushed tones, and a deal was struck.